Thames moved slowly that April morning in 1896, the water dark as old iron beneath the pale London sky. A bargeman worked his pole through the shallows near Reading, his breath clouding in the dawn cold when his pole struck something soft. He pushed harder. The object rolled, heavy and yielding, wrapped in brown parcel paper tied with white edging tape. The knot was neat, deliberate, the kind a careful hand might use for posting a package. But parcels did not float with such terrible buoyancy, and they did not leak that particular smell, faint at first, then unmistakable, into the morning air. The bargeman dragged it to shore. His hands trembled as he loosened the twine. Inside the sodden paper, a small form lay curled, barely larger than a loaf of bread. The infant's face was turned toward the light it would never see, the neck circled by white tape pulled tight, embedded deep into the flesh. The body was perhaps 4 months old, dressed in a flannel gown that had once been white. Pinned to the gown was a scrap of paper, the ink bleeding but still legible, a name, an address, a receipt of payment. The bargeman stood in the shallow water, holding what remained of someone's child, and understood that this was not the first. The Thames had carried secrets before, but this morning the river had decided to speak, and in a modest house in Caversham, a woman named Amelia Dyer was preparing her morning tea, unaware that the water had finally betrayed her. Chapter 1. The Angel Maker. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small and still. Wherever you are listening, whether beneath warm blankets in a quiet room, or in the gentle darkness of a late hour, take a moment to settle. What time is it where you are? Is the house silent? Are the streets empty? Good. Then let us drift backward together, through the years and across the cold waters of Victorian England, to a time when desperation wore a kind face and murder hid behind the word care. Before we begin our descent into this particular darkness, I invite you to subscribe to this channel if the shadows of history call to you. If you find comfort in these whispered truths from the past, your subscription helps this work continue, helps these forgotten voices find their way through time to your evening stillness. And if this story moves you, if it settles into your thoughts as you drift towards sleep, leave your thoughts below. Tell me which corner of history you would like to explore next. Now, let the present fall away. Let us go back. The year is 1806, but the story begins much earlier, in the narrow streets and rented rooms of Victorian England, where shame and poverty moved hand in hand through the vogue. It was an age of empire and industry, of gaslight and propriety, of rigid moral codes that bent only in the dark. And in that darkness, a particular kind of transaction flourished, conducted in parlours and back rooms, negotiated through carefully worded advertisements in newspapers, carried out with the efficiency of any other business. They called it baby farming. The women who practiced it called themselves nurses, or foster mothers, or adoption agents. The desperate mothers who sought them out called them angels. But the infants who passed through their hands called them nothing at all, for most would never learn to speak. Baby farming was not illegal in itself. The practice of taking in infants for payment, whether temporarily or permanently, served a need that Victorian society acknowledged only in whispers. An unmarried woman who found herself with child-faced ruin, social, economic, and familial, her reputation would be destroyed, her employment would end, her family might cast her out. The workhouse beckoned, with its stone walls and cold charity, or the streets, with their older and more certain destructions. But there existed another option, advertised discreetly in the back pages of newspapers, offered by women who understood the currency of shame. For a fee, a respectable woman would take the child. She would care for it, raise it, perhaps find it a proper home. Or, for a larger sum paid all at once, she would adopt the child entirely, freeing the mother to return to her life as though nothing had occurred. The transaction was clean, the separation final. No questions would be asked, no judgment would be offered. The mother could go back to her position in service, or return to her family with her secret intact. or marry the man who had promised himself to her before the child's existence made such promises impossible. And the child would be cared for. That was the promise. That was the lie. Amelia Dyer understood this system with perfect clarity. She had trained as a nurse, had attended births, both legitimate and shameful, had seen the terror in young women's faces where they realised what their condition meant. She had watched infants born into silence, received by midwives who knew they would not be kept, wrapped quickly and carried away before the mother's milk could come in, before attachment could form. She had witnessed the machinery of Victorian morality at work, the way it created problems and then punished those who suffered them. And she had recognised, with the practical intelligence that would serve her for 3 decades, that there was profit in this suffering. The business model was simple. Amelia would place advertisements in newspapers, the Bristol Times and Mirror, the Western Daily Press, later the Daily Telegraph and other London papers. The wording was carefully crafted, designed to attract the right kind of customer while avoiding the attention of authorities who occasionally took interest in such matters. A married couple with no family would adopt healthy child, nice country home, terms £15. Or, respectable woman seeks infant to adopt, premium required, references exchanged. The word premium was important. It suggested a one-time payment, a complete transfer of responsibility. It implied permanence, care, a future. It meant the mother need never think of the child again. The responses came steadily. Letters arrived from desperate women, from families seeking to hide a daughter's disgrace, from workhouses looking to reduce their burden of foundlings. Amelia answered each one with sympathy and efficiency. She provided references, sometimes real, more often invented. She described her comfortable home, her love of children, her Christian charity. She quoted prices, £10 for a temporary arrangement, £15 for permanent adoption, sometimes £20 if the mother seemed able to pay. The negotiation was conducted through letters, then telegrams as the years progressed, and technology made the transaction faster. Finally, a meeting would be arranged at a railway station, a public place where anonymity was assured. The mother would arrive carrying her bundled infant, her face often veiled, her manner anxious. Amelia would greet her warmly, her appearance reassuring, a stout, respectable-looking woman in her middle years, dressed neatly, speaking kindly. She would coo over the baby, remarking on its health and beauty. She would accept the payment, counting it discreetly. Sometimes she provided a receipt on which she wrote a false name and address. Sometimes she offered to send letters updating the mother on the child's progress, though such letters rarely came, and when they did, they were brief and vague. Then she would take the infant, and the mother would leave, walking away through the crowd with empty arms and the desperate hope that she had done the right thing, the only thing, that her child would be loved and raised and given the chance she could not provide. The infant would survive perhaps a few days, sometimes a few weeks. Amelia's method varied depending on circumstances and convenience. The simplest approach was starvation. Infants fed only water thickened with a bitter flour, their cries growing weaker until silence came. Laudanum was efficient, the opiate tincture administered in doses that brought sleep and then stillness. But the method that Amelia came to prefer, the one that left the least evidence and worked most quickly, involved a length of white edging tape, the kind used for dressmaking and parcels. It was strong, thin, and left distinctive marks that could be explained if anyone asked, as diaper rash or natural creasing. She would wrap it around the infant's neck and pull, not violently, but with steady pressure, until the small body stopped moving. The process took only moments. Then the body would be wrapped in brown paper or old newspapers, tied with string or more of the white tape and weighted with a brick or stone. After dark, Amelia or someone in her household would carry the parcel to the Thames, or to the canal, or to whatever water was nearest and consign it to the depths. The water was kind to Amelia Dyer for nearly 30 years. It accepted her parcels without complaint, held them beneath its surface, carried them away from the places they had entered. Occasionally a body would surface, bloated and unidentifiable, examined briefly by authorities who noted the death but rarely investigated further. These were the children of poverty and shame, after all, the unwanted and unnamed. Their deaths merited a line in a coroner's report, perhaps a paragraph in a local newspaper, then burial in a pauper's grave. The system that had failed them in life failed them equally in death. But Amelia's business thrived. She moved frequently, from Bristol to London, from London to Reading, from one rented house to another, always staying ahead of neighbours who grew suspicious, landlords who asked questions, authorities who occasionally noticed the pattern. She married twice, the first husband dying of typhoid, the second a drunkard who knew of her work and shared in its profits. She bore children of her own, and they survived, grew, even assisted in the enterprise. Her daughter Polly married a man named Palmer, and together they helped manage the flow of infants into and out of the household. It became a family business, conducted with the same mundane efficiency as any other trade. The Victorian age prided itself on progress, on reform, on the slow expansion of rights and protections. Laws were passed regulating child labour, improving sanitation, expanding education. But the baby farmers operated in the gaps of that progress, in the spaces where morality and law had not yet reached, where shame kept victims silent and poverty kept them desperate. The mothers who gave up their children rarely spoke of it afterward. The infants who died left no advocates. And the women like Amelia Dyer, who turned human desperation into a profitable enterprise, remained largely invisible to a society that preferred not to see what its own moral strictures had created. By the 1890s, Amelia had refined her operation to a smooth efficiency. She had learned which newspapers attracted the most responses, which language drew the most desperate clients, which railway stations offered the best anonymity. She had learned to vary her aliases, Mrs. Harding, Mrs. Thomas, Mrs. Smith, and her addresses, providing false locations that could not be traced. She had learned to dispose of clothing and possessions at pawnshops across London and Reading, converting the remnants of her victims into ready cash. She had learned to keep moving, to trust no one outside her immediate family, to show no remorse. The work had become routine, the deaths a simple matter of business. She had long since stopped counting. But in April of 1896, the Thames decided to speak. A bargeman's pole struck something soft in the shallow water near Reading. Then another body surfaced, and another. Within days, the police had recovered 6 infant corpses, all wrapped identically, all bearing the marks of white tape around their throats, and on several of the parcels, scraps of paper remained, with names and addresses that could be traced. The water, which had been Amelia's accomplice for 3 decades, had finally become her betrayer. The silence she had relied upon began to crack, and in a modest house in Caversham, Amelia Dyer continued her morning routine, unaware that the machinery of justice had finally slowly begun to turn in her direction. The fog rolled thick over the Thames that April. In its grey shroud, the river carried its secrets to shore, and Victorian England prepared to confront what it had long permitted to exist in shadow. Chapter 2. A Nurse's Education. Amelia Elizabeth Hobley was born in the village of Pile Marsh, Bristol, in the year 1837, into a world that was changing faster than memory could hold. The England of her childhood was still half rural, still bound to the rhythms of harvest and season, but already the factories were rising, the railways spreading, the cities swelling with populations drawn from the countryside by the promise of wages and the threat of enclosure. Her family occupied that uncertain space between respectability and poverty. Her father a shoemaker, a tradesman with his own shop, a man who could read and write and expected his children to do the same. There were 5 children in all, Amelia somewhere in the middle, neither the eldest with responsibility nor the youngest with indulgence, but one of those children who learned early to observe, to calculate, to understand that survival required more than luck. Her mother died when Amelia was young, the details lost to time, but the cause likely one of the common killers of Victorian women: childbirth, typhoid, consumption. The loss left a gap in the household that the surviving children learned to navigate, taking on adult duties while still in childhood. learning the skills that would see them through. Amelia proved quick with her hands, good at sewing and mending, patient with the tedious work that kept clothes serviceable and households running. Her father remarried, and the new wife brought her own rhythms to the house, her own expectations. Amelia learned what many young women learned, that a stepmother's home was not always a haven, that independence, when it could be achieved, was worth pursuing. At 16, she entered training as a nurse. This was before Florence Nightingale had transformed the profession, before nursing became associated with discipline and respectability and rigorous education. In the 1850s, a nurse was often simply a woman who tended the sick, who had learned through experience rather than instruction, who worked for wages that barely sustained life. Amelia trained under a midwife in Bristol, a woman who attended births in the cramped rooms of the poor and occasionally in the more comfortable chambers of the merchants and tradesmen. The work was hard, the hours irregular, the sights often disturbing. She learned to manage pain without adequate medicines, to deliver infants in conditions that would horrify later generations, to wash bodies and change linens and maintain a calm demeanour when faced with suffering. But she learned other things too. She learned that there were two kinds of births, those celebrated and those concealed. She attended women in labour who wept not with pain but with shame, who begged for silence, who refused to look at the infants they had carried for 9 months. She saw babies born in workhouses, in lodging houses, in the homes of women whose families had cast them out. She witnessed the midwife accept payment for discretion, for arranging the quiet disappearance of an unwanted child, for providing contacts who would take an infant away and ask no questions. She learned that there was a market in human desperation, and that those who served that market could make a living from it. In 1861, at the age of 24, Amelia married George Thomas, a man nearly 30 years her senior. He was a steward, a respectable position, and the marriage seemed to promise stability. They settled in Bristol, and Amelia continued her nursing work, attending births and tending the sick while managing her own household. She bore 2 children, a daughter, Ellen, and a son, William. The children survived infancy, a success not guaranteed in an age when childhood mortality claimed nearly half of all children before their 5th year. Amelia proved a capable mother to her own, attentive and protective, qualities that would later seem bitterly ironic given what she would do to the children of others. But George Thomas drank. The steadiness that his age and position had promised dissolved in gin and beer, his wages disappearing into public houses, his temper turning mean when the alcohol took hold. Amelia found herself the primary provider, her nursing work no longer supplementary but essential. The respectability she had married for became a facade maintained with increasing difficulty. She took in more clients, worked longer hours, accepted cases that other nurses might refuse, and she began to notice something that would shape the rest of her life. The willingness of certain mothers to pay almost any sum to be free of their infants, and the ease with which those infants could simply vanish. Her first ventures into baby farming were cautious, almost accidental. A young servant girl recently delivered of an illegitimate child asked if Amelia knew of anyone who might take the baby. Amelia agreed to keep it temporarily for a weekly fee. The infant was sickly, and within a week it had died, genuinely of natural causes that claimed so many infants of that era. But the mother, when informed, seemed relieved rather than grieving. She paid what was owed and disappeared back into her life. Amelia kept the incident to herself, and she began to consider the possibilities. She placed her first advertisement in 1869, carefully worded, in a Bristol newspaper. The response was immediate, 3 letters within a week, each from a woman seeking to place an infant. Amelia met with each and negotiated terms, took payment. 2 of the infants she passed along to other women who genuinely wanted to adopt, keeping a fee for her services as intermediary. But the 3rd child, a girl of perhaps 3 months, she kept herself. She fed it sparingly, doses of milk stretched thin with water, mixed with a bit of laudanum to keep it quiet. The infant weakened, cried less, finally stopped breathing one night while the household slept. Amelia wrapped the small body in newspaper and dropped it into the River Avon from a bridge, the dark water accepting it without sound. No one inquired, no one noticed. The mother never wrote asking after the child. That first deliberate killing was an experiment, a crossing of a boundary that, once stepped over, revealed how easily the next step could be taken. Amelia discovered something about herself in that moment, that she could do this thing without the guilt or horror she might have expected. The infant had been an abstraction to her, a problem solved, a transaction completed. She felt relief at its silence, satisfaction at the profit retained. Whatever capacity for mercy or maternal feeling she possessed did not extend to these children, these unwanted scraps of humanity that mothers were willing to pay to be rid of. They were products in a market, and she was simply a businesswoman meeting a demand. Over the following years, she refined her methods. She learned that advertising in multiple newspapers increased her customer base. She discovered that mothers would pay more for a promise of adoption than for temporary care, and that permanent placement required no follow-up, no letters, no accountability. She found that infants could be acquired from workhouses for a small premium, the authorities eager to reduce their burden and not inclined to ask difficult questions about where the children went. She established relationships with pawnbrokers who asked nothing about the provenance of the infant clothing and small possessions she regularly sold. She moved her operation beyond Bristol into the growing sprawl of London, where anonymity was easier and the customer base larger. George Thomas died in 1869, typhoid taking him as it took so many in the crowded, unsanitary cities of Victorian England. Amelia mourned him briefly, if at all, and continued her work. In 1879 she married again, this time to a man named William Dyer, a labourer who drank as heavily as her first husband, but proved more useful to her enterprise. He was willing to assist with the disposal of bodies, to help with the logistics of moving house when neighbours grew suspicious, to accept his wife's income without inquiring too closely about its source. He was, in essence, an accomplice, though whether he fully understood the scale of what his wife was doing remains uncertain. By the 1880s, Amelia's business had achieved a terrible efficiency. She handled perhaps a dozen infants a month during busy periods, each one representing a payment of £10 to £20, substantial sums for a working-class woman. She kept detailed records of nothing, maintained no accounts, trusted her memory and her caution. She taught her daughter Polly the trade, and when Polly married a man named Arthur Palmer, he too became part of the operation. The family worked together. A criminal enterprise disguised as domestic life, conducted in rented houses that they left before suspicion could crystallize into investigation. But there were close calls. In 1879, a doctor became suspicious about the number of infant deaths in a house where Amelia was staying. Questions were asked, though no charges followed. In 1890, she was called to testify in a case involving another baby farmer who had been caught, and Amelia's own practices came briefly under scrutiny. She demonstrated a remarkable ability to appear respectable, to present herself as a charitable woman performing a difficult service to deflect inquiry with wounded dignity. The authorities, lacking hard evidence and reluctant to pursue a middle-aged woman who seemed so conventional, allowed her to slip away. She moved, changed her name, resumed her work. The Victorian system protected her through its own contradictions. The society that condemned illegitimacy with such ferocity created the conditions that made baby farmers necessary. The laws that punished infanticide looked away from the mechanisms that enabled it. The newspapers that railed against immorality accepted advertisements that facilitated the disposal of its consequences. Amelia operated within these contradictions, exploiting them with the skill of someone who understood the machinery completely. She was a symptom of the age's hypocrisies, a creature created by the gap between what Victorian England professed to believe and what it actually permitted. By 1806, Amelia Dyer had been killing infants for nearly 30 years. The number of her victims would never be known with certainty. Estimates would range from 200 to 400, perhaps more. She had become not merely a murderer, but a serial murderer operating at a scale that Victorian England had never encountered. She had transformed the act of killing into a routine, a business practice, something she did with no more emotional engagement than a butcher felt slaughtering livestock. The infants were not children to her. They were inventory, transactions, problems to be efficiently resolved. And she resolved them, one after another, year after year, in the rented houses of Reading and London, in the quiet hours after dark with lengths of white tape pulled tight around throats too small to scream. The Thames flowed on, carrying its burden of small bodies, holding its secrets beneath the dark water. And Amelia Dyer continued her work, confident in the protection that shame and poverty and Victorian morality provided her. She had learned her trade well. She had been taught by the very society that would eventually condemn her, and she had become a master of her craft, an angel of death wearing the face of respectable womanhood. The education she had begun as a young nurse in Bristol had reached its terrible completion, and still she did not stop. Chapter 3. The Advertisements. The back pages of Victorian newspapers were a marketplace of euphemism and coded language, a place where the desperate and the unscrupulous met through carefully chosen words that said everything and nothing. Among the advertisements for patent medicines promising miracle cures, the notices seeking respectable servants, the offerings of rooms to let and pianos for sale, there appeared with increasing frequency a particular type of announcement. Married couple, childless, would adopt healthy infant, premium required, references given and expected. Or, lady of means wishes to adopt baby girl, loving home assured, country residence, terms moderate. Or, widow lady would take infant from birth, complete care and affection guaranteed, small premium, right Mrs. Harding, care of post office, Reading. The language was domestic, reassuring, suggesting kindness and permanence. The reality was often murder. Amelia Dyer understood the power of words on paper, the way they could create illusions that would draw in the vulnerable and desperate. She crafted her advertisements with care, testing different phrasings to see which produced the most responses, which newspapers attracted the most profitable clients. The Daily Telegraph was particularly fruitful, its London circulation including both working-class readers and the servants of wealthy households, exactly the population most likely to need her services. Regional papers like the Western Daily Press served rural areas where young women fell pregnant by farm labourers or village boys, where shame was more difficult to hide in small communities, where the need for discretion was absolute. The word premium was essential to her business model. It signified a one-time payment rather than ongoing weekly fees. A mother paying weekly might expect updates, might visit, might maintain some connection to her child, but a premium suggested finality, a complete transfer of responsibility. The mother paid, handed over her infant, and walked away with the understanding that the transaction was concluded. She need never think of the child again. She was free. And Amelia, having received perhaps £15 or £20, more than many working women earned in half a year, was free as well. Free to do what she wished with the infant, with no obligation to preserve its life, no accountability to anyone. The responses to these advertisements arrived as letters, written in hands that ranged from educated copperplate to barely literate scrawl, each one a small tragedy compressed into a few lines of desperate prose. Dear Madam, I am writing to inquire about your advertisement in the Daily Telegraph. I find myself in a most unfortunate situation and am seeking a respectable woman who might provide a proper home for an infant. I can provide the premium you mention. Please write to me at the address below, but do not use my name on the envelope. Yours in hope. The shame was palpable in every line, the fear that someone might intercept the letter, that a landlady or employer might discover the correspondence, that the carefully maintained facade of respectability might shatter. Amelia answered each letter promptly, her replies warm and reassuring. She wrote of her comfortable home, her Christian values, her love of children. She explained that she had raised her own children successfully, and now, in her later years, wished to provide a loving home for unfortunate infants who needed care. She requested details: the child's age and health, the mother's circumstances, the amount the mother could afford to pay. She provided references, sometimes real addresses of acquaintances who would vouch for her, more often invented names and locations that sounded respectable but could not be easily verified. She suggested a meeting place, usually a railway station where crowds provided anonymity, and where she could arrive and depart without being traced to any particular address. The meetings followed a pattern that Amelia perfected over years of practice. She would arrive at the designated station, Reading, Paddington, Cheltenham, dressed respectably in dark clothing, a shawl around her shoulders, a bonnet hiding much of her face. She was a stout woman by this time, middle-aged, with the appearance of solidity and maternal competence. Her manner was kind, her voice gentle. She would greet the mother with sympathy, remarking on the difficulty of the situation, assuring her that she was doing the right thing, the loving thing. She would examine the infant with apparent tenderness, commenting on its health and beauty, predicting a bright future for the child in her care. The exchange of money was handled discreetly. The mother would pass an envelope or purse to Amelia, who would count the contents carefully but without ostentation. Sometimes she provided a receipt, though the name she signed was never her real one: Mrs. Smith, Mrs. Jones, Mrs. Thomas. The address she gave was equally false, or led to a post office where she collected mail but did not reside. Then she would take the infant, wrapped in whatever shawl or blanket the mother had brought, and offer final reassurances. She would promise to send word of the child settling in, though such promises were rarely kept. She would watch the mother walk away, shoulders bent with grief or relief, or both, disappearing into the crowd, and then she would turn and leave herself, carrying the infant toward whatever lodging she currently occupied, the child's fate already decided. The infants came from every stratum of societies, below the truly wealthy. Some were the children of servants who'd been seduced or raped by employers or their sons, the pregnancy discovered too late for abortion and carried to term in terror of dismissal and ruin. Some were born to factory girls, to shop assistants, to laundresses and seamstresses, women whose wages were barely sufficient for their own survival and could not stretch to support a child. Some came from young women of slightly better circumstances, the daughters of clerks or shopkeepers, whose families had scraped together the premium to save their daughter's reputation and their own. And some came from the workhouses, those grim institutions where unmarried mothers laboured until their children were old enough to be apprenticed or placed out, the authorities willing to pay someone like Amelia to take an infant off their hands and reduce the burden on the parish rates. Each mother had her own story, her own desperate calculation that led her to answer Amelia's advertisement. There was the housemaid seduced by the son of the family where she worked, thrown out when her condition became visible, desperate to place the baby and find new employment before her small savings ran out. There was the widow with 3 children already, barely surviving, who had taken comfort with a neighbour and found herself pregnant again, unable to feed another mouth. There was the young woman whose fiancé had disappeared when she told him about the child, leaving her alone and ashamed. There was the factory girl who had been raped walking home after dark, who carried the pregnancy in secret and gave birth alone in her rented room, wrapping the infant in rags and taking it to the address she'd found in the newspaper. The workhouse children came with official sanction, their departure recorded in ledgers that tracked the movement of pauper children as bureaucratically as the movement of supplies. A matron would contact Amelia, offering an infant for a fee of £5 or £10 paid by the parish. The child would be brought to a designated location, paperwork would be signed using whatever false name Amelia was currently employing, and the transaction would be complete. The workhouse authorities were satisfied to have reduced their population by 1. Amelia was satisfied to have acquired an infant for which she had been paid rather than having to pay. And the child, anonymous from birth, unnamed or given only a temporary designation, passed from one form of institutional death to another, more final kind. The advertisements appeared in newspapers throughout the 1880s and into the 1890s, a steady drumbeat of opportunity for those who knew how to read between the lines. Other baby farmers placed similar notices, and the market was competitive. Amelia varied her approach to stand out, sometimes emphasizing her country home, sometimes her Christian charity, sometimes the health benefits of rural air for delicate infants. She used different names in different papers, creating the illusion of multiple respectable women offering similar services, when in reality they were all the same person, operating the same deadly enterprise from a series of rented addresses. The newspapers themselves bore some responsibility for enabling the trade they facilitated. Editors knew, or should have known, what these advertisements actually offered. The pattern was obvious to anyone who cared to look. The emphasis on premium payments, the vague promises of adoption, the carefully maintained anonymity. But advertising revenue was advertising revenue, and the newspapers accepted the notices without inquiry. When scandals occasionally erupted, when a particularly egregious case of baby farming came to public attention, the papers would express shock and horror in their editorial pages, while continuing to accept similar advertisements in their classified sections. The hypocrisy was complete. By the mid-1890s, Amelia was operating at the height of her efficiency, handling multiple infants simultaneously, her household a clearing station for unwanted children. Her daughter Polly and son-in-law Arthur Palmer assisted with the work, meeting mothers when Amelia could not, collecting infants from railway stations, helping with the grim task of disposal. The family had relocated to Reading, to a house at 45 Kensington Road in the district of Caversham, a respectable working-class neighbourhood where no one suspected the horrors being conducted behind closed doors. The landlord saw a middle-aged woman and her family, quiet tenants who paid their rent on time and caused no disturbance. The neighbours noticed the occasional arrival of a woman carrying a baby, but such sights were not unusual in an era of large families and informal childcare arrangements. The infants rarely survived more than a few days in Amelia's care. Some were killed immediately upon arrival, strangled with the white tape and wrapped for disposal that same night. Others were kept alive briefly while Amelia dealt with other business, fed just enough to keep them quiet, but not enough to sustain life, their cries growing weaker until they stopped. She showed no preference in her victims, no mercy for the healthy or the sickly, the boys or the girls, the newborns or the older infants. They were all the same to her, problems to be solved, goods to be processed, sources of income that became inconvenient burdens once the payment was received. The clothing the infants arrived in was carefully sorted and sold. Baby gowns, flannel wraps, small bonnets, bootees, these items had value, and Amelia wasted nothing. She made regular trips to pawn shops in Reading and London, selling the garments in small batches to avoid suspicion, using the proceeds to supplement her income. The pawnbrokers asked no questions. Baby clothes were common enough commodities in poor neighbourhoods, and a middle-aged woman selling them might be anyone, a grandmother whose grandchildren had outgrown their garments, a woman fallen on hard times selling her own children's outgrown things, a dealer in second-hand goods. The items bore no names, no marks of identification. They passed into the second-hand trade and were lost. The advertisements continued to appear, and the responses continued to arrive, and the terrible machinery of Amelia's enterprise ground on through the seasons. In spring and summer the work was easier, the bodies disposed of more readily, the smell of death less likely to attract attention. In winter the frozen ground made burial difficult, but the cold slowed decomposition, and the Thames flowed dark and concealing. Amelia adapted to the rhythms of her terrible work, scheduling her activities around practical considerations, managing her business with the same mundane planning that any shopkeeper might apply to inventory and sales. The mothers who answered her advertisements never knew what they were truly purchasing. They believed, or forced themselves to believe, that their children were being adopted, loved, raised in the country homes and comfortable circumstances that Amelia described. Some tried to maintain contact, sending letters to the false addresses Amelia had provided, letters that were never answered or returned unopened. Most tried not to think about it at all, pushing the memory down into some locked corner of consciousness, getting on with the lives that surrendering their children had allowed them to reclaim. They could not afford to imagine the truth, and so they did not. The advertisements ran until the very end, until the week before Amelia's arrest. The last one appeared in the Daily Telegraph in March 1896, offering the same promises, seeking the same desperate clients, written in the same reassuring language that had lured mothers for nearly 3 decades. By the time it was published, the Thames had already begun to give up its dead. But Amelia, confident in her methods and her luck, placed the advertisement anyway. There were always more customers, there was always more money to be made, and the white tape was always ready. Chapter 4. The White Tape. The tape was perhaps 3/4 of an inch wide, made of cotton, dyed white, manufactured in the mills of Lancashire or Yorkshire, and sold in haberdashery shops throughout England for a penny or 2 per yard. It was called edging tape, or sometimes stay tape, used by dressmakers to bind seams and reinforce garments, by housewives to wrap parcels and tie bundles, by nurses to secure bandages and fasten linens. It was common, unremarkable, found in nearly every household where sewing was done. In Amelia Dyer's hands, it became an instrument of death, used hundreds of times, the ligature that ended small lives with efficient silence. The method was simple, quick, and left the kind of evidence that could be explained away if discovered before decomposition was too advanced. A length of tape, perhaps 18 inches, tied loosely at first around the infant's neck as though it were part of a garment or a teething necklace. Then, when the moment came, pulled tight from behind, the cotton fibres biting into the soft flesh, cutting off air and blood flow to the brain. An infant's neck was so small, so fragile, that little force was required. The resistance lasted only seconds, a brief stiffening of the tiny body, a flutter of hands too weak to fight, perhaps a small sound cut off before it could become a cry. Then stillness. The whole process took less than a minute. And then there was silence, and Amelia would lay the small corpse aside and attend to other matters, returning later to prepare it for disposal. She had learned through experience that strangulation with tape was superior to other methods. Suffocation with a pillow was uncertain and took longer, required sustained pressure, and left the infant's face distorted in a way that might provoke uncomfortable questions if the body were discovered. Drowning required access to water and the risk of being seen or heard, and left the lungs full of fluid that might cause the body to bloat and rise too quickly. Poison was expensive and difficult to obtain in quantities, and some poisons left obvious traces in the tissues. Starvation, which she had used extensively in her early years, was too slow, meant days of weak crying that might disturb neighbours or attract attention, required maintaining the pretense of care, while the infant gradually wasted away. But the tape was perfect. It was silent. It was quick. It left marks that looked like rope burns or pressure sores from tight clothing, the kind of thing that might occur in any infant left lying too long in one position, swaddled too tightly, cared for by someone careless or ignorant. The tape itself could be removed after death. The ligature marks explained if necessary as accidental injuries, and if the body was quickly wrapped and weighted and consigned to water, decomposition would blur the evidence within days, making it impossible to determine whether death had come from drowning or strangulation or natural causes. The water was the final accomplice, erasing what the tape had written on small throats. Amelia killed in the back rooms of the rented houses where she lived, in the hours after dark when neighbours were less likely to notice, when the sounds of the household could mask any small disturbance. She killed in the kitchen while her husband William sat in the parlour with his drink. She killed in the bedroom she shared with him, the dead infant laid on the floor while she finished her preparations for disposal. She killed while her daughter Polly and son-in-law Arthur Palmer were present in the house, the family continuing their evening routines while murder was conducted with mundane efficiency in the next room. It became a normal part of household life, like cooking or washing or any other domestic task. The work had to be done, And so it was done. Sometimes she killed an infant within hours of receiving it, impatient to have the matter concluded, eager to convert the child from a living liability into a disposable corpse. She would meet the mother at the railway station, take the infant, travel back to Reading, and by nightfall the child would be dead and wrapped, ready for the Thames. Other times she kept infants alive for days or even weeks, a decision based on practical considerations rather than mercy. If she was expecting visits from landlords or neighbours, if there was some reason to maintain the appearance of fostering a living child, she would feed the infant just enough to keep it alive and quiet. But eventually, when circumstances permitted, the tape would come out, and the child would join the others who had passed through her hands and out of existence. The wrapping of the bodies followed its own ritual of practicality. Brown paper was best. The heavy wrapping paper used for parcels strong enough not to tear when wet, opaque enough to conceal its contents. Sometimes she used old newspapers instead, layering them so thick. Particularly the pages with dense text and no illustrations. The body would be placed in the centre of the paper, often still dressed in whatever garment it had arrived in, though sometimes stripped if the clothing had value and could be sold. Then the paper would be folded around it, tight and neat, secured with string or more of the white tape. A brick or stone would be included in the parcel, heavy enough to weigh it down, prevent it from floating. The final package looked like any other parcel, the kind that might contain second-hand clothes or unwanted household items, the kind that someone might dispose of in the river without attracting particular notice. The disposal runs happened after dark, usually between 10 in the evening and 2 in the morning, when the streets were quiet and the river deserted. William Dyer often assisted with this part of the work, or Arthur Palmer. The parcels carried in a carpet bag or wrapped in a shawl. The walk to the Thames taking 15 or 20 minutes from the house on Kensington Road. There were several places along the river where the bank was accessible, and the water deep enough to ensure the parcel would sink. A bridge offered the easiest disposal, the parcel simply dropped from the side into the dark water below, the splash muffled by the sound of the current. But bridges also had the risk of witnesses, and when crossing at an inopportune moment, someone looking out a window. Better were the quieter stretches of bank, places where one could kneel at the water's edge and push the parcel out into the flow, watching it sink beneath the surface and disappear. Amelia made these trips perhaps once a week, sometimes more often if business was particularly brisk, sometimes less if she had kept infants alive longer than usual. Each parcel represented a concluded transaction, a problem solved, a profit secured. She felt no more emotion disposing of these packages than she would have felt throwing away rubbish. The infants had never been real to her, never been children with futures and possibilities. They had been unwanted from the moment of their conception, rejected by their mothers, condemned by society, born into a world that had no place for them. She was simply acknowledging that reality, carrying out the sentence that had already been pronounced. And the river accepted what she gave it, the dark water closing over each small bundle, carrying it downstream toward the estuary and the sea. But water keeps nothing forever. Bodies weighted with stone sometimes shifted, the stones working free, the parcels rising. Decomposition created gases that increased buoyancy, causing corpses to surface days or weeks after disposal. Current patterns were unpredictable, carrying packages far from where they had entered the water, depositing them in shallows or on mud banks where they would be discovered. And the Thames was a working river, crowded with barges and boats, with men who earned their living on the water and who noticed when something unusual floated past. Through the 1870s and 1880s, bodies of infants were periodically discovered in the Thames and its tributaries, pulled from the water by bargemen or fishermen, examined by coroners who noted the manner of death, and then moved on to other cases. The dead were too numerous, too anonymous to merit extended investigation. They were buried in paupers' graves and forgotten. But by the mid-1890s, the sheer volume of infant corpses in the Thames had become difficult to ignore. The newspapers began to notice, to comment on the disturbing frequency of such discoveries, to ask questions about what was happening and who was responsible. The term baby farming entered common usage, the public beginning to understand that these deaths were not random tragedies but the result of systematic exploitation. Reformers called for regulation, for licensing of anyone who took in infants for payment, for inspections and accountability. But the legislation was slow to develop, the authorities uncertain how to address a problem, so entangled with the shame and hypocrisy of Victorian sexual morality. Amelia paid little attention to these stirrings of concern. She had been disposing of bodies in the Thames for nearly 30 years without significant interference. She had been questioned by police a few times, had talked her way out of suspicion with respectable demeanour and plausible explanations, had moved to new locations when things became uncomfortable. The system protected her through its own reluctance to confront what she represented. She was confident that the pattern would continue, that the water would keep accepting her offerings, that the dead infants would remain anonymous and uninvestigated. She had no reason to believe that anything would change, but the white tape that had served her swell was also her signature, the distinctive mark that would eventually connect the scattered bodies, that would transform a series of unfortunate discoveries into evidence of systematic murder. The tape left patterns on the throats of her victims, grooves and compression marks that were consistent across different corpses, that suggested the same method and possibly the same hand. And when the parcels themselves were recovered intact, with the tape used to bind the wrapping as well as to kill the infant inside, the connection became undeniable. The tape was common, yes, but its use in this particular way, with this particular consistency, pointed toward a single source, and that source could be traced. In April of 1896, a bargeman named Charles Humphreys was working the Thames near Reading when his pole struck something soft in the shallow water. He pulled it to shore and unwrapped it carefully, revealing the body of an infant girl, perhaps 4 months old, dressed in a flannel gown, the neck marked by the deep grooves from white edging tape. The tape was still present, wound tight, embedded in the decomposing flesh. Within days, more bodies surfaced, 6 in total within a 2-week period, all wrapped in brown paper or newspaper, all weighted with stones or bricks, all bearing the marks of the same white tape. And on several of the parcels, scraps of paper remained that had not been part of the wrapping, receipts, labels, fragments of letters, and those scraps bore names and addresses that could be traced. The Thames had finally spoken clearly enough that even the reluctant authorities could not ignore its testimony. The white tape, Amelia's instrument of efficient murder, had become the thread that would weave together evidence of her crimes, that would lead detectives from the river to the house in Caversham, from anonymous corpses to a named killer. The method that had served her for 3 decades had finally betrayed her, and in her house, in her sewing basket, in drawers and cupboards, there were spools of white edging tape, ready for use, indistinguishable from the tape found wrapped around the throats of the dead. The connection was about to be made. The silence was about to end. Chapter 5. The First Suspicions. The house at 45 Kensington Road in Caversham was unremarkable in every visible way, a narrow terraced dwelling indistinguishable from its neighbours, with lace curtains in the windows and a small front garden that was neither particularly tended nor entirely neglected. The neighbourhood was respectable without being prosperous, inhabited by clerks and skilled tradesmen, by widows living on small pensions and young families just beginning to establish themselves. It was the kind of place where people kept to themselves, where privacy was valued and curiosity about neighbours' business was considered poor manners. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of place where someone like Amelia Dyer could operate with minimal interference, but even in neighbourhoods that prided themselves on minding their own business, there were always those who noticed, who observed, who filed away small inconsistencies that accumulated over time into patterns of unease. The woman next door, Mrs. Smith, had commented to her husband about the number of young women who came to the Dyer residence carrying infants, how they would enter the house but leave without their babies, their faces sometimes tear-stained, their arms empty. The explanation seemed obvious enough at first. Mrs. Dyer was taking in children to foster, a common enough arrangement. But Mrs. Smith had sharp ears, and she noticed that while infants entered the house regularly, she rarely heard the sound of babies crying, and when she did hear crying, it was weak, brief, quickly silenced. Then there was the smell. During warm weather, particularly in the summer months of 1805, an unpleasant odour had emanated from the Dyer house, sweet and rotting, the kind of smell that suggested something dead or decaying. Mrs. Dyer had explained when asked that a cat had died under the floorboards, or that meat had spoiled in the larder, or that the drains were backing up. The explanations were plausible enough individually, but their frequency raised questions. And there was something about Mrs. Dyer herself that made people uncomfortable, though they would have struggled to articulate exactly what. She was polite, even pleasant, but there was a flatness to her effect, a lack of warmth that seemed inconsistent with someone who supposedly loved children and devoted herself to their care. The landlord, a man named Mayo, had his own concerns. He had rented the house to the Dyers in September 1895, and they had been good tenants in most respects. Rent paid on time, no disturbances, no complaints from neighbours about noise or disorder. But when he visited the property to inspect its condition, he noticed things that troubled him. There were stains on the floors that Mrs. Dyer could not adequately explain, dark marks that might have been water damage or might have been something else. There was a quantity of infant clothing stored in trunks and boxes, far more than would be needed for the 1 or 2 foster children Mrs. Dyer claimed to be caring for, and there were nights when he had passed by the house late and seen lights burning in the back rooms, shadows moving behind the curtains, activity at hours when respectable households were asleep. But suspicion without evidence remained merely discomfort, and discomfort was not sufficient to prompt action in an age when people were reluctant to interfere in others' affairs. Mrs. Smith mentioned her unease to other neighbours, but no one wanted to be the person who made false accusations, who reported respectable-seeming people to the police based on nothing more than a feeling. The landlord considered terminating the lease, but hesitated, unwilling to lose good-paying tenants without cause. And so the household at 45 Kensington Road continued its operations through the autumn and winter of 1895 and into the early months of 1896, while those around it felt vague unease but took no action. The police had their own accumulating file on Amelia Dyer, though they did not yet know it. Over the years, her name, or rather the various names she had used, appeared in reports from different jurisdictions, scattered references that had never been compiled into a single narrative. In 1879, when she was still operating primarily in Bristol, a doctor had reported concerns about the number of infant deaths associated with a house where she was living. The investigation had been cursory, the authorities accepting her explanation that she fostered sickly children and that their deaths were unfortunate but natural. The case had been closed without charges. In 1890, she had been called as a witness in the trial of another baby farmer named Annie Took, who had been convicted of neglecting infants in her care. Amelia testified about the difficulties of caring for sick children, the challenges of foster care, presenting herself as a respectable woman who could speak to the realities of the trade. The police who interviewed her had noted something odd in her manner, a detachment that seemed inappropriate, but they had no grounds to pursue the matter further. She had not been charged with anything, had merely provided testimony, and she had disappeared back into anonymity. There had been other moments when she had brushed close to exposure. In 1893, a mother who had placed her infant with Amelia had grown suspicious when her letters requesting updates went unanswered. She'd gone to the address Amelia had provided, only to find it was a false location, a shop whose owner had never heard of anyone named Mrs. Harding. The mother had reported the matter to police, but by the time they began investigating, Amelia had moved, changed names, and vanished into the vastness of London's population. The case had languished, the mother eventually giving up her search, perhaps not wanting to know what had truly become of her child. The problem was systemic. Police jurisdictions were local, and someone who moved frequently across county boundaries could easily evade the kind of scrutiny that might have revealed a pattern. Records were not centralised. Information was not shared effectively between different police forces, and the crimes themselves, the murder of unwanted infants, were not prioritised by authorities who had limited resources and many competing demands. Baby farming existed in a grey area of law and social concern, acknowledged as a problem in the abstract but rarely pursued with vigour in specific cases. The victims had no advocates, no families demanding justice, no public constituency insisting on investigation. They were the children no one wanted, and their deaths provoked more relief than outrage. For by the mid-1890s, the accumulation of infant bodies in the Thames had become impossible to ignore entirely. The newspapers, always eager for sensational stories, had begun reporting on the discoveries with increasing frequency. Headlines spoke of another tiny victim found and the Thames murder mystery. Editorial writers called for reform, for regulation of baby farming, for police action against those who profited from the disposal of unwanted children. The public, confronted with the evidence of systematic infanticide, began to demand that something be done, and the police, under pressure from both the press and their own supervisors, began to take the matter more seriously. In early 1896, Scotland Yard assigned Detective Inspector James Anderson to investigate the Thames infant murders. Anderson was a methodical investigator, known for his patience and attention to detail, qualities that would prove essential in unravelling a case that spanned decades and involved crimes committed across multiple jurisdictions. He began by examining the bodies that had been recovered, looking for commonalities, for patterns that might suggest a single perpetrator or a connected network of killers. What he found was the white tape present in case after case used in the same way, leaving the same distinctive marks. It was a signature, and signatures could be traced. Anderson also examined the wrappings in which the bodies had been found. Some of the parcels had remained intact enough to preserve fragments of paper, scraps of labels, pieces of string. On one parcel recovered in March, according to 1896, there was a portion of an address label, water damaged but partially legible. The name was unclear, but the location was Reading. Another parcel contained a fragment of what appeared to be a pawn ticket issued by a shop in London. A third had been wrapped in newspaper pages that, when carefully reconstructed, proved to be from a specific edition of a local Reading paper. These were small pieces of evidence, easy to overlook individually, but taken together they suggested that whoever was disposing of these bodies was operating in or around Reading and had connections to London as well. Anderson began making inquiries in Reading, speaking with local police, asking about anyone known to be involved in baby farming or foster care. The local constabulary was familiar with the practice. There were several women in the area who took in infants for payment, most of them operating legally, or at least not obviously criminally. But when Anderson described the pattern he was investigating, the white tape, the Thames disposals, the sheer number of victims, one name emerged repeatedly: Mrs. Thomas, or Mrs. Harding, or Mrs. Smith. A woman who had lived at several different addresses in Reading over the past few years, who placed advertisements in newspapers offering to adopt infants, who was known to have financial resources despite no obvious legitimate income. A woman described as middle-aged, stout, respectable-looking, but somehow unsettling to those who dealt with her. The addresses Anderson collected were mostly false or outdated, the names obviously aliases, but the descriptions were consistent enough to suggest they referred to the same person. And one piece of information proved crucial. Several people mentioned that this woman had a daughter who sometimes assisted her, a younger woman married to a man named Palmer. That name, Palmer, was less common than Smith or Thomas, more traceable. And when Anderson began searching for Arthur Palmer in Reading, he found him residing at 45 Kensington Road, Caversham, living with his wife Polly and her mother, a Mrs. Dyer. Anderson did not move immediately. He was aware that alerting the suspects prematurely might cause them to flee, to destroy evidence, to vanish as they had done before when questions were asked. Instead, he began surveillance of the house, watching who came and went, noting the pattern of visitors, and what he saw confirmed his suspicions. Young women arrived carrying infants. They entered the house, stayed for a short time, and left without the babies. Sometimes Mrs. Dyer herself met them at the railway station, visible from a distance, conducting her transactions in the open as she had done for years, confident that no one would interfere. Anderson also began tracing the financial trail. He contacted pawn shops in Reading and London, asking about anyone who regularly sold infant clothing and small children's items. Several pawnbrokers remembered a woman matching Mrs. Dyer's description, someone who came in every few weeks with small bundles of baby clothes, always accepting whatever price was offered without haggling, seeming eager to complete the transaction and leave. Anderson collected receipts, matched dates, built a timeline that showed a steady flow of infant garments being converted to cash over a period of months. Meanwhile, the Thames continued to give up its dead. In early April, 6 bodies were recovered within 2 weeks, all showing the same signs: the white tape, the brown paper wrapping, the stones for weight. The newspapers screamed the story across their front pages. The public demanded action, and Anderson knew that he had enough evidence to move, that the time for surveillance had ended and the time for arrest had come. He obtained a warrant to search 45 Kensington Road and to detain its occupants for questioning. He assembled a team of officers to execute the warrant, briefing them on what they might find, preparing them for what was likely to be a disturbing scene. On the evening of April 3rd, 1806, as darkness settled over Reading and Amelia Dyer prepared her supper in the kitchen of her rented house, unaware that the machinery of justice had finally inexorably turned in her direction, Detective Inspector Anderson and his officers moved into position outside. The neighbours, peering through their curtains, saw the police gathering on the Kensington Road. Mrs. Smith, who had long suspected something wrong, felt a mixture of vindication and horror. The landlord Mayo, summoned to provide access to the property, waited with his keys, his hand shaking slightly, and inside the house, in the quiet moments before the knock came on the door, Amelia Dyer sat with her family, the white tape coiled in her sewing basket, the latest parcel waiting to be carried to the river, the terrible machinery of her trade still turning, still efficient, not yet aware that it was about to be stopped. The knock, when it came, was loud and authoritative, and with it, the long silence that had protected Amelia Dyer for 30 years finally irrevocably began to break. Chapter 6. The Asylum Years. The asylum at Wells in Somerset was a grey stone building set among trees, its windows barred, its doors locked, its grounds enclosed by walls high enough to discourage escape but designed to look like decoration, rather than imprisonment. It was officially called the Somerset and Bath Pauper Lunatic Asylum, though most people simply referred to it as Wells, the name carrying sufficient weight that no further description was needed. Those sent there were the mad, the melancholic, the morally insane, the alcoholic, the epileptic, the demented, all the categories of mental disorder that Victorian medicine recognised but could not effectively treat. And in May of 1879, Amelia Dyer was admitted as a patient, diagnosed with melancholia, her committal arranged by family members who claimed she had attempted suicide and was no longer capable of caring for herself. Whether her condition was genuine or feigned remains uncertain even now. The timing of her breakdown was convenient, coming as it did when questions were being asked about the number of infant deaths associated with addresses where she had lived in Bristol. A doctor named Alfred Colmer had grown suspicious after treating several babies whom Amelia had claimed to be fostering, all of whom had died within weeks of being placed in her care. He had reported his concerns to the local authorities, and an investigation had begun, and then, suddenly, Amelia had collapsed, become incoherent, attempted to drown herself in the River Avon, her family finding her wet and distraught, muttering about dead children and judgment. The family had committed her. The investigation had stalled for lack of a defendant capable of standing trial, and by the time Amelia was released 6 months later, the inquiries had been abandoned. The asylum was a refuge and a prison both, its dual nature evident in every aspect of its operation. Patients were confined, their movements restricted, their liberties suspended, but they were also protected from the consequences of their actions, sheltered from prosecution, treated as sick rather than criminal. The Victorian understanding of madness was evolving during these years, moving slowly from the old belief in moral failings towards a more medical model that saw mental disorder as illness requiring treatment. But the treatment available was limited and often ineffective. Purges and emetics to balance the humours, cold baths and enforced labour to strengthen the will, isolation and restraint to prevent harm. For someone like Amelia, who may have been sane but desperate to avoid legal consequences, the asylum offered a temporary escape at the cost of temporary captivity. Her days at Wells followed the rigid routine imposed on all patients. She rose at 6 when the attendants unlocked the dormitory doors and herded the women to the washrooms, where they cleaned themselves in cold water under supervision. Breakfast was at 7, a meal of bread and porridge eaten on in silence in the dining hall, the attendants watching for any disturbance, any sign of violence or agitation. Then came the work assignments. The asylum operated on the principle that labour was therapeutic, that idle hands invited madness. Amelia was assigned to the laundry, where she spent her mornings washing the institution's endless supply of soiled linens, her hands red and raw from the harsh soap and hot water. The afternoons were for walking in the grounds, weather permitting, the patients moving in slow circles around the garden paths, always within sight of attendants, the walls always visible at the edge of vision. Some patients talked to themselves, gestured at invisible companions, wept or laughed without apparent cause. Others, like Amelia, remained quiet, observing, adapting to the rhythms of institutional life with the same practical intelligence she applied to everything. She spoke when spoken to, followed instructions without resistance, showed no signs of the melancholia that had supposedly driven her to suicide. She was, by all accounts, a model patient, cooperative and calm, exactly the kind of inmate that asylum administrators appreciated for not causing trouble. The doctor who supervised her case, a man named Forbes, noted in his record that Mrs. Dyer showed significant improvement within weeks of admission. Her suicidal ideation had apparently resolved. Her mood had stabilized. She expressed remorse for the worry she had caused her family and gratitude for the care she was receiving. She spoke reasonably about her situation, acknowledging that she had been unwell, but insisting that she was now recovered and eager to return to normal life. Forbes was inclined to believe her. The asylum was overcrowded, the resources stretched thin, and patients who showed improvement were generally released as quickly as possible to make room for the acute cases constantly arriving. But there were complications. The authorities in Bristol had not entirely forgotten the questions surrounding Amelia's activities before her committal. A police inspector visited the asylum in July to inquire about when she might be fit to answer questions about the infant deaths that had prompted the investigation. Forbes explained that the patient was still recovering, that interrogation would risk triggering a relapse, that it would be medically inadvisable to subject her to legal proceedings in her current fragile state. The inspector, lacking evidence sufficient to charge her even if she were released, accepted this assessment and departed. The investigation remained open but inactive, waiting for a defendant who was indefinitely unavailable. Amelia understood the protection the asylum provided. As long as she remained a patient, she could not be prosecuted. As long as the doctors considered her too fragile for questioning, the investigation could not proceed. But she also understood that she could not remain at Wells forever, that eventually she would have to be released, and that when that happened, questions might resume. So she began planning, thinking through how she would restart her business once free, how she would avoid the mistakes that had drawn attention in Bristol, how she would operate more carefully in the future. The asylum, rather than reforming her, gave her time to consider her methods and refine her approach. The other patients at Wells were a cross-section of Victorian mental disorder and social failure. There were women driven mad by childbirth, by poverty, by the deaths of children, their minds broken by griefs too heavy to bear. There were alcoholics whose drinking had progressed from vice to addiction to madness, their hands trembling, their speech slurred, their bodies wasted. There were young women suffering from what the doctors called hysteria, their symptom ranging from paralysis to convulsions to dramatic emotional outbursts. There were elderly women with dementia, their memories dissolving, their personalities fragmenting, their confusion occasionally erupting into violence. And there were women who were not mad at all, but had been committed by families who found them inconvenient, women who had borne illegitimate children, women who had refused marriages, women whose behaviour or opinions had embarrassed their relatives. Amelia observed them all with the same flat, calculating attention she brought to everything. She saw how the system worked, how patients who cooperated were treated better than those who resisted, how compliance brought privileges and rebellion brought restraints. She learned which attendants could be manipulated with flattery, which doctors could be convinced with displays of appropriate emotion. She became expert at presenting the appearance of recovery, at saying the things that medical authority wanted to hear, at performing sanity as effectively as she had performed respectability in her baby farming business. The asylum was simply another system to navigate, another structure to exploit, and she proved as capable in this environment as she had in any other. In November of 1879, after 6 months of confinement, Dr. Forbes certified that Amelia Dyer had recovered sufficiently to be released to the care of her family. She had, he wrote in his final report, responded well to the therapeutic regime of the asylum, shown no recurrence of suicidal thoughts or melancholic delusions, and was now fit to return to society under appropriate supervision. The family was contacted, arrangements were made, and on a cold morning in late November, Amelia walked out of the gates of Wells Asylum, collected her few possessions, and departed with her son William and daughter Ellen, who had come to escort her home. The Bristol police, when informed of her release, considered reopening their investigation, but found that the evidence they had collected had been lost or misfiled, that witnesses had moved or died, that the momentum of the case had dissipated during the months of Amelia's institutionalization. Without a clear path forward and with limited resources for pursuing old cases, they allowed the matter to drop. Amelia Dyer was free, her reputation damaged but not destroyed, her liberty intact, her business interrupted but not ended, and within months she had relocated to London, adopted new aliases, and resumed placing advertisements in newspapers, offering her services to desperate mothers, returning to the trade that had sustained her before her inconvenient breakdown. The asylum years had taught her caution but not conscience. She had learned to be more careful about disposing of bodies, to vary her methods and locations, to avoid establishing patterns that might attract attention. She had learned to move more frequently, to use false names more consistently, to maintain even less connection with the mothers who entrusted their children to her. She had learned that the authorities could be evaded through madness as easily as through anonymity, that the Victorian system was more concerned with appearance than reality, that someone who looked respectable and spoke reasonably could get away with almost anything. In London, she found the conditions even more favourable than they had been in Bristol. The city's vast population provided a constant supply of desperate mothers. The police forces were fragmented across different jurisdictions, making coordination difficult. The Thames offered convenient disposal, its dark waters flowing through the heart of the metropolis, accessible from hundreds of locations. And the poverty and shame that created her customer base were even more intense in London than in smaller cities. The competition for employment fiercer, the consequences of disgrace more severe, the need for her services more urgent. By 1880, she was operating at full capacity again, handling multiple infants per week, disposing of bodies in the Thames with the same efficiency she had employed before her asylum interlude. The white tape came out again. The brown paper parcels were prepared again. The midnight walks to the river resumed. The machinery of murder that had been temporarily halted by her committal was back in operation, running smoothly, generating steady income. And this time she was more careful, more disciplined, more determined not to be caught. The asylum had been an inconvenience but not a deterrent. It had cost her 6 months of liberty and the temporary disruption of her business, but it had also saved her from prosecution, given her time to let investigations cool, provided a ready excuse for any past suspicions. She had learned that the system could be used, that institutions designed to confine could also protect, that the label of madness could be donned and discarded as circumstances required. It was simply another tool in her arsenal, another strategy for survival in a world where survival required constant calculation and adaptation. And so Amelia Dyer continued her work through the 1880s and into the 1890s, killing with the same mechanical efficiency, showing the same complete absence of remorse or hesitation. The children died by the dozens, by the hundreds, their small bodies wrapped and weighted and consigned to water, their mothers never knowing the truth, their deaths generating no grief beyond the immediate moments of their dying. And Amelia prospered, moving from house to house, from alias to alias, accumulating money and maintaining the appearance of modest respectability, a middle-aged woman engaged in charity work, a widow making her way in the world, a grandmother caring for unfortunate children. The asylum years faded into memory, one more episode in a long career of successful deception, one more obstacle overcome through intelligence and ruthlessness, and an understanding of how systems could be manipulated by those willing to do so without conscience or constraint. Chapter 7. The River Speaks. April in 1896 was unseasonably cold. The Thames running grey and swift with spring rains, its surface choppy with wind, its banks muddy and treacherous. The bargemen who worked the river wore heavy coats against the chill, their breath clouding as they poled their vessels through the shallows or guided their craft along the deeper channels. The Thames was a working river, crowded with commercial traffic, its waters carrying not just boats but the refuse of London and the towns along its length, sewage and industrial waste, dead animals and discarded goods, all the detritus of Victorian civilization flowing toward the sea. The bargemen were accustomed to seeing unpleasant things in the water, to steering around floating debris, to occasionally hauling out objects that had some salvage value. But in that cold April, the river began giving up cargo that even these hardened men found disturbing. On April 1st, a bargeman named Charles Humphreys was working near Reading, poling along the shallows where the current slowed and eddies formed, when his pole struck something yielding. He prodded it, felt it roll, recognized the distinctive weight and texture. He had found bodies before, suicides mostly, people who had jumped from bridges in despair or fallen drunk from embankments, but this felt smaller, lighter. He manoeuvred his craft closer and reached down with his hook, snagging the object and pulling it to the surface. It was a parcel wrapped in brown paper, tied with string sodden and heavy, about 18 inches long. The paper was coming apart, and through a tear he could see fabric, and inside the fabric something small and pale that had once been alive. Humphreys pulled the parcel onto his barge and carefully unwrapped it, his hands unsteady, despite years of handling unpleasant cargo. Inside was the body of an infant, a girl perhaps 4 months old, dressed in a white flannel gown. The neck bore deep grooves, marks where something had been pulled tight, embedded in the decomposing flesh. Wrapped around the throat, partially hidden by the gown, was a length of white edging tape, tied in a neat knot at the back. The body was weighted with a brick placed inside the wrapping to drag it down. But the brick had shifted, the parcel had become buoyant with decomposition gases, and the river had carried it to a shallow where it could be found. Humphreys reported his discovery to the police at Reading, and the body was brought to the mortuary where it was examined by Dr. Morris, the police surgeon. Morris noted the tape around the neck, the marks of strangulation, the deliberate nature of the disposal. This was not an infant who had died naturally and been discreetly discarded by a desperate mother. This was murder, systematic and calculated. Morris preserved the tape as evidence, photographed the marks on the throat, prepared a detailed report. And before that report could be filed, another body was discovered. On April 3rd, 2 days after the first discovery, another bargeman found another parcel in the Thames, this one near Caversham. The pattern was identical, brown paper wrapping, string binding, a brick for weight, and inside another infant, this one a boy of about 3 months, strangled with white tape. The following day brought a third body, then a fourth, then a fifth and sixth. Within 2 weeks, the Thames had yielded 6 infant corpses, all disposed of in the same manner, all bearing the signature of the white tape, all found within a few miles of Reading. The river, which had held its secrets for so long, was suddenly speaking with terrible clarity. The newspapers seized on the story with the hunger that Victorian journalism brought to sensational crime. The headlines grew larger and more lurid with each discovery. Thames horror: babies found murdered. The reading mystery: police seek baby killer. 6 tiny victims, who is responsible? The stories ran on front pages across the country, accompanied by illustrations that showed the wrapped parcels, the grieving mothers imagined by artists who had never met them, the dark waters of the Thames rendered in dramatic woodcuts. The public, confronted with evidence of systematic infanticide, responded with a mixture of horror and fascination. Letters poured into newspaper offices demanding action, calling for the death penalty for baby farmers, insisting that the police do their duty and catch whoever was responsible. Detective Inspector James Anderson of Scotland Yard, already investigating the pattern of infant deaths in the Thames, found himself suddenly at the centre of a case that had captured national attention. The pressure to solve it was intense, coming from his superiors, from the press, from members of Parliament who asked questions in the House of Commons about what was being done to stop these atrocities. Anderson worked methodically through the evidence, examining each recovered body, cataloguing the similarities, looking for connections that might lead to a suspect. The white tape was the key. It appeared in every case, used in exactly the same way, suggesting a single perpetrator or a closely connected group. Anderson traced the tape to its likely source. It was common edging tape, available at any haberdasher or draper, but the consistency of its use suggested someone with a preferred method, a habit. He examined the wrapping paper and string, noting that some of the parcels contained fragments of labels or addresses, water-damaged but occasionally legible. On one parcel he found part of a name, Mrs. Thomas, and an address in Reading. On another, a fragment of a pawn ticket from a shop in London. On a third, newspaper pages that could be dated to specific editions, narrowing the time frame. Anderson began compiling a list of everyone in Reading known to be involved in baby farming or foster care. The practice was not illegal per se, but it was regulated, requiring licenses and inspections for those who took in more than one infant at a time. Many baby farmers operated without licenses, however, conducting their business quietly, avoiding official notice. Anderson interviewed doctors who had treated infants in foster care, asking about suspicious deaths or concerning patterns. He spoke with neighbours who had noticed unusual activity in their streets, women coming and going with babies, infants arriving but never heard crying. And gradually a picture emerged of a woman who moved frequently, used multiple names, placed advertisements in newspapers, and seemed to have an endless supply of infants passing through her care. The name Dyer came up repeatedly in Anderson's inquiries, though always attached to different first names and addresses. Mrs. Dyer at one location, Mrs. Thomas at another, Mrs. Harding at a third. But the descriptions were consistent: a stout, middle-aged woman with a respectable appearance, often accompanied by a younger woman who was her daughter, sometimes by a son-in-law named Palmer. Anderson focused his investigation on locating this woman, tracing her through the maze of false names and abandoned addresses, following a trail that led eventually to 45 Kensington Road in Caversham. Meanwhile, the Thames continued to reveal its burden. More bodies surfaced through April, though not all were recent victims of the woman Anderson was seeking. Some had been in the water for months, their state of decomposition making identification impossible, their connection to the current case uncertain. But each discovery renewed public outrage, intensified the pressure on police, fed the newspaper coverage that made the Thames murders the most prominent crime story in England that spring. The river had become a symbol of Victorian social ills. Its dark waters a repository for the consequences of poverty and shame, and a moral code that condemned illegitimacy while creating the conditions that made infanticide profitable. The mothers who had given their babies to Amelia Dyer began to come forward, slowly at first, then in increasing numbers as the newspaper coverage made them realise what might have happened to their children. They arrived at police stations hesitant and fearful, some giving false names even as they reported their suspicions, others weeping as they described the transactions that now seemed so obviously suspect. A servant girl from London told how she had answered an advertisement, met a woman at Paddington Station, paid £15 and handed over her 3-month-old daughter, received a receipt signed Mrs. Harding with an address that turned out to be false. A factory worker from Bristol described meeting a woman who had taken her infant son, promising to raise him in the country, sending one brief letter 6 months later and then silence. Some of the mothers brought evidence, the receipts they had been given, the letters they had received, the advertisements they had answered, carefully preserved in the hope that they might someday be able to reclaim their children or at least know what had become of them. Anderson collected these documents, compared handwriting, traced addresses, built a case that grew stronger with each new witness. The receipts were written in several different hands, suggesting multiple people involved in the enterprise. But certain patterns recurred: the false names, the emphasis on premiums rather than weekly payments, the promises of loving homes that were never substantiated. One mother provided the breakthrough Anderson needed. Evelina Marmon was a barmaid from Cheltenham who had placed her infant daughter with a Mrs. Thomas in March of 1806, paying £10 for adoption. She'd grown suspicious when her letters requesting updates went unanswered, when the address she'd been given proved to be a post office box rather than a residence. She'd gone to Reading to investigate, asking questions, showing people the receipt she'd been given, and someone had directed her to 45 Kensington Road, saying that was where Mrs. Thomas lived, though she went by the name Dyer now. Marmon brought this information to the police, and Anderson verified it through surveillance. He watched the house, saw the pattern of young women arriving with infants. Amelia Dyer herself conducting her business with the same calm efficiency she had employed for 30 years. And he saw something else, late at night, a man leaving the house carrying what looked like a large bundle or package, walking toward the river. Anderson followed at a distance, watched as the man, later identified as Arthur Palmer, made his way to the Thames embankment and stood for a moment looking at the dark water. But on this occasion, perhaps sensing he was being watched, Palmer turned and walked back without depositing anything. Anderson did not confront him, not yet. He wanted to catch them with evidence, wanted to search the house and find proof that would be undeniable in court. On the evening of April 3rd, as the 6th body was being recovered from the Thames, Anderson assembled his team of officers and briefed them on the search warrant he had obtained. They would move that night, would surround the house before dawn and enter at first light, would detain all the occupants and search every room, every cupboard, every hidden space. They would find evidence. Anderson was certain of it. The river had finally spoken clearly enough that justice could not look away. The bodies wrapped in brown paper, strangled with white tape, weighted with bricks and stones. These were not anonymous victims anymore. They were evidence of systematic murder, and that evidence pointed directly to 45 Kensington Road and the woman who lived there. The Thames flowed on through the darkness, its waters still carrying secrets but no longer holding them. The silence that had protected Amelia Dyer for 3 decades was breaking word by word, body by body, witness by witness. The river had been her accomplice and was now her betrayer. And as dawn approached on April 4th, 1896, Detective Inspector Anderson and his officers moved into position outside a modest terraced house in Caversham, preparing to knock on a door and bring an end to one of the longest and most prolific killing sprees in British criminal history. The river had spoken now. It was time for the law to answer. Chapter 8. The House in Caversham. The knock came at dawn, hard and insistent, the kind of pounding that left no doubt about its authority. Inside 45 Kensington Road, the household was still settling into the rhythms of morning. William Dyer in the kitchen lighting the fire, Polly Palmer upstairs dressing, Arthur Palmer pulling on his boots in the hallway, and Amelia in the back room, wrapping a parcel with brown paper. Her movements practiced and efficient, the small bundle on the table before her silent and still. The knock interrupted all of this, froze the household for a moment in tableau, each person suddenly aware that something had changed, that the careful routine was about to be shattered. Arthur answered the door, opening it to find Detective Inspector Anderson standing on the step with 6 uniformed constables behind him, their presence filling the narrow street drawing the Solwar, attention of neighbours who were just beginning their own mornings. Anderson identified himself, produced the warrant, and pushed past Arthur into the house before any objection could be raised. The officers followed, dispersing through the rooms with the efficiency of men who had done this work before, calling out to each other as they secured the premises, herding the occupants into the front parlour where they could be watched while the search proceeded. Amelia stood in the parlour with her family, her face calm, showing nothing of whatever she might have felt. She was 59 years old, stout and grey-haired, dressed in a dark house dress and apron, looking like any other respectable working-class woman starting her day. When Anderson addressed her, asking if she was Mrs. Dyer, she acknowledged it without hesitation. When he asked if she took in infants for payment, she confirmed that she did, explaining that she provided foster care and adoption services for unfortunate children, that it was charitable work she had done for many years. Her voice was steady, her manner dignified, as though she were discussing church activities rather than facing a police search of her home. But as the officers began their systematic examination of the house, pulling open drawers and cupboards, lifting floorboards and feeling behind furniture, the evidence of what had actually occurred within these walls began to accumulate in the front parlour, where Anderson had established his command post. The findings came in a steady stream through the morning hours, each discovery adding weight to the case, each item carried downstairs and laid out on the parlour table where it could be catalogued and preserved. The first officer to report brought infant clothing, dozens of garments, far more than could be explained by the 1 or 2 children Amelia claimed to be fostering. Small gowns and flannel wraps, booties and bonnets, some new or nearly new, some stained and worn, all bundled into trunks and boxes stored in the upstairs bedrooms. Anderson examined them, noting the quality and variety, recognising that these represented many different children, many different transactions. Some bore laundry marks or embroidered initials, evidence that they had belonged to specific infants, that they had been acquired along with the babies and retained after the babies themselves had disappeared. Then came the pawn tickets, discovered in a drawer in Amelia's bedroom, neatly organised by date and shop. There were dozens of them, receipts from pawnbrokers in Reading and London, recording the sale of infant clothing and small items over a period of months. Anderson traced the pattern. Amelia would acquire an infant along with its possessions, kill the child, and then systematically pawn the clothing, converting the baby's effects into cash. The tickets provided a record of this process, a financial trail that documented how many children had passed through her hands. The amounts were small, a shilling here, 6pence there, but they accumulated across dozens of transactions into substantial sums. In the kitchen, officers found supplies that took on sinister significance in light of what they were investigating. Rolls of brown paper, the heavy wrapping paper used for parcels, balls of string and cord, several bricks and large stones, stacked in a corner, their purpose now obvious. And in a sewing basket near the fireplace, spools of white edging tape, identical to the tape found wrapped around the throats of the infants pulled from the Thames. Anderson held the tape in his hands, measuring it against the descriptions in his notes, seeing how it matched exactly the ligatures that had killed at least 6 children and likely hundreds more. The search extended to the garden, where officers dug in several locations looking for graves or hidden evidence. They found nothing buried, but in the privy at the back of the property, they discovered parcels that had not yet been disposed of. 2 infants, both recently dead, both wrapped in brown paper and weighted with bricks, ready for transport to the river. The bodies were brought into the house, laid carefully in the hallway, the officers who had found them visibly disturbed despite their professional training. One was a girl of perhaps 5 months, dressed in a white gown. The other was a boy, younger, maybe 3 months. Both bore the marks of the white tape around their necks, the distinctive grooves pressed deep into the flesh. Anderson questioned Amelia about these bodies, asking her to explain their presence. She claimed they had died of natural causes, that she had been caring for sickly infants who had succumbed despite her best efforts, that she had wrapped them for burial and simply had not yet arranged for their interment. The explanation was absurd, the wrapping clearly intended for water disposal rather than burial, the presence of weights making the purpose obvious. But Amelia delivered it calmly, maintaining her dignity, insisting that she had done nothing wrong, that she was being persecuted for her charitable work. The officers also found letters and telegrams, correspondence with mothers seeking to place their children. Some of these communications were recent. Inquiries from women who had not yet sent their babies, who had seen the newspaper advertisements and responded, who were now unknowingly corresponding with a woman who had already murdered hundreds of infants. Anderson collected these letters carefully, recognizing that they represented lives saved, children who would not now be handed over to Amelia Dyer, mothers who would have to find other solutions but whose babies would at least survive. In Polly Palmer's room, officers found more clothing and several small items of jewellery, cheap pieces, the kind that working-class mothers might have pinned to their babies' gowns or tucked into the bundles they handed over, small tokens meant to identify their children or bring them luck. Polly claimed ignorance of how these items had come into her possession, insisting she knew nothing of her mother's business, that she had believed the infants were being properly cared for. But Anderson noted that she lived in the house, that she must have seen the infants arrive and never heard them cry afterward, that she had been present during the disposal runs to the river. Her denials rang hollow. Arthur Palmer, when questioned, proved more forthcoming, perhaps recognizing that his situation was precarious and that cooperation might serve him better than loyalty. He admitted to helping dispose of parcels in the Thames, claimed he had not known what was inside them, insisted that his mother-in-law had told him they contained old clothing or rubbish, but under Anderson's questioning his story fell apart. He acknowledged that he had known some of the parcels contained dead infants, that he had been paid for his silence and assistance, that he had participated in the enterprise for financial gain. His testimony would prove crucial in the case against Amelia, providing direct evidence of her disposal methods and the systematic nature of her crimes. As the search continued through the afternoon, neighbours gathered in the street outside, watching the officers carry evidence from the house, whispering among themselves about what was being discovered. Mrs. Smith, the neighbour who had long suspected something wrong, stood at her window and wept, vindicated but horrified, wishing she had acted sooner, that she had trusted her instincts and reported her concerns before so many more children had died. The landlord Mayo arrived when summoned, examined the damage the search was doing to his property, and expressed shock that such things had occurred under his roof, though he too had had suspicions he had not pursued. By evening, Anderson had assembled enough evidence to charge Amelia Dyer with multiple counts of murder. The bodies of the 2 infants found in the privy, the tape and wrapping materials, the pawn tickets and infant clothing, the testimonies of Palmer and the mothers who had placed children with her. Together, these created an overwhelming case. Anderson arrested Amelia, formally charging her with the willful murder of an infant girl named Doris Marmon, daughter of Evelina Marmon, whose body had been one of those recovered from the Thames. He also arrested Polly and Arthur Palmer as accessories, though their charges would later be reduced when they agreed to testify against Amelia. Amelia was taken to Reading Police Station and placed in a cell, her calm demeanour finally cracking as the reality of her situation became clear. She asked for paper and pen, said she wanted to write a statement, a confession that would spare her family from prosecution. Anderson provided the materials, and Amelia spent several hours writing, producing a document that would become central to her trial. In it, she admitted to killing Doris, Marmon and a great many others, though she did not specify how many. She claimed that she had acted alone, that her daughter and son-in-law had no knowledge of the murders, that all guilt was hers and hers alone. She wrote that she had been driven to the work by financial necessity, that she had meant no harm but had become trapped in a pattern she could not escape. The confession was self-serving in its details, designed to protect her family and perhaps to establish a defense of diminished responsibility, to suggest that she had been overwhelmed by circumstances rather than acting with deliberate evil intent. But it was also a tacit acknowledgement of guilt, an admission that she had killed not just one or two children, but many, that the crimes extended back years, that the bodies in the Thames were her doing. Anderson read the confession carefully, noting what it revealed and what it concealed, recognizing that the full truth of Amelia's crimes might never be known, that the number of her victim could only be estimated based on the evidence that had survived. The house at 45 Kensington Road was sealed as a crime scene, the evidence carefully removed and transported to police storage. The rooms that had seemed so ordinary that morning now carried the weight of horror, the knowledge of what had occurred within them transforming every surface and corner into testimony. The kitchen table where Amelia had prepared her parcels, the bedroom where infants had been strangled, the privy where bodies had waited for disposal, these spaces would be examined and photographed, documented in the official record, described in court testimony. The house would never be lived in again, at least not for years, its association with murder making it uninhabitable, a place haunted not by ghosts but by memory. The search had yielded everything Anderson needed to bring the case to trial and secure a conviction. The physical evidence was overwhelming, the testimonies damning, the confession definitive. But beyond the legal necessities, the search had revealed something about the nature of the crimes themselves, about how systematic and businesslike they had been, how completely Amelia had transformed murder into a domestic routine. The parcels neatly wrapped, the bodies carefully weighted, the clothing efficiently pawned. Every aspect of the enterprise showed planning and organisation, the application of practical intelligence to the problem of killing and disposing of unwanted infants. There was no passion in these crimes, no rage or panic, just cold calculation and mechanical execution. As darkness fell over Reading on that April evening, Anderson stood outside 45 Kensington Road and looked at the modest facade, trying to reconcile its ordinary appearance with the extraordinary evil that had been conducted within. He thought of the mothers who had come to this door with their babies, desperate and trusting, believing they were leaving their children in safe hands. He thought of the infants who had died here, their short lives ending with the pull of white tape, their small bodies wrapped like parcels and carried away in the dark. And he thought of the river, flowing through the night just a few streets away, its waters still carrying secrets but no longer keeping them, his long complicity with Amelia Dyer's crimes finally broken. The house stood silent in the gathering darkness, its windows empty, its door locked, bearing witness to nothing now but its own shame. The evidence had been collected, the arrests made, the first steps of justice taken. But the full accounting of what had occurred within those walls would take months to unfold, as the trial prepared and witnesses came forward and the true scale of Amelia Dyer's crimes gradually became clear. The house in Caversham had given up its secrets. Now the courts would decide what those secrets meant and what price would be paid for 3 decades of murder conducted with such terrible methodical efficiency. Chapter 9. The Trial of the Century. The Old Bailey in London was the Central Criminal Court of England, a building of grey stone and imposing architecture that housed the machinery of Victorian justice. Its courtrooms had witnessed countless trials, from petty theft to high treason, but in May of 1896 it prepared for a case that would capture the attention of the entire nation. The trial of Amelia Dyer, charged with the murder of infant Doris Marmon, was scheduled to begin on May the 21st, though the proceedings would encompass far more than a single death, would attempt to account for 3 decades of systematic infanticide, would force Victorian England to confront the darkest implications of its own social structures. The courtroom was filled to capacity long before the proceedings began, spectators arriving hours early to secure seats, crowds gathering outside in the hope of glimpsing the defendant, the atmosphere charged with a mixture of horror and fascination. The public galleries were dominated by women, many of them working class, some perhaps mothers who had themselves faced the desperate choices that led others to seek out baby farmers. The press benches were crowded with journalists from every major newspaper, their notebooks ready, knowing that this trial would generate copy for weeks, that every detail would be read with rapt attention across the country and beyond. Amelia entered the dock shortly after 10 in the morning, escorted by 2 female warders, her appearance drawing immediate reaction from the crowd. She wore a black dress, deliberately chosen to present a respectable image, her grey hair pinned neatly, her face composed though pale from her weeks in custody. She was 59 years old, stout and ordinary-looking, a woman who could have been anyone's grandmother, someone who might be seen in church or at market without attracting any particular notice. The disconnect between her appearance and the nature of her crimes created a cognitive dissonance that many observers would comment on. How could this unremarkable woman have killed hundreds of children? How could such evil hide behind such banality? The judge presiding was Justice Hawkins, a stern figure known for his meticulous attention to legal procedure and his willingness to impose harsh sentences when he deemed them warranted. He had reviewed the preliminary materials in the case and understood that while Amelia was charged with only one murder, the death of Doris Marman, the trial would necessarily encompass evidence of many other deaths, would require him to manage proceedings that could easily become unwieldy if not carefully controlled. He instructed the jury that they were to determine guilt or innocence only regarding the charge before them, but that evidence of other crimes might be admitted if it established pattern or method or motive. The prosecution was led by Justice Dankworts, an experienced barrister who had prepared his case with thoroughness, knowing that the circumstantial nature of much of the evidence required careful presentation. He could not prove how many children Amelia had killed, could not present bodies for most of the victim, could not even name more than a handful of the dead. But he could prove that she had systematically acquired infants for payment, that those infants had then disappeared, that bodies had been found in the Thames bearing evidence of murder and disposal consistent with Amelia's methods, and that Doris Marman specifically had been placed in Amelia's care and had subsequently been found dead, strangled and wrapped in Amelia's distinctive manner. The defence was conducted by Mr. Kapadia, who faced an almost impossible task. His client had confessed to the crime, the physical evidence against her was substantial, and the public sentiment was entirely hostile. His only realistic strategy was to argue diminished responsibility, to suggest that Amelia had been driven mad by poverty and circumstance, that she had not possessed the mental capacity to understand the wrongfulness of her actions. It was a desperate argument, contradicted by the systematic nature of the crimes, the careful planning evident in every aspect of her enterprise, the confession itself which showed clear reasoning and understanding. But it was the only defence available to a woman who had admitted killing a great many children. The trial began with Dankworts outlining the case for the prosecution, speaking in measured tones that nonetheless conveyed the horror of what had occurred. He described the discovery of bodies in the Thames, the white tape that appeared in case after case, the investigation that had led to 45 Kensington Road. He explained the business model of baby farming, how desperate mothers paid premiums to women who promised to care for their children, how those promises were betrayed with murder. He told the jury that they would hear from mothers who had entrusted their babies to the defendant, from police officers who had searched her house and found evidence of systematic killing, from the coroner who had examined the bodies and determined the cause of death. And he told them that at the end of the evidence, they would have no choice but to conclude that Amelia Dyer had murdered Doris Marman and countless others with deliberation and without remorse. The first witness was Evelina Marmon, the barmaid from Cheltenham whose infant daughter was the subject of the charge. She took the stand trembling, her voice barely audible, as she described how she had answered an advertisement in the Western Daily Press, how she had corresponded with a woman calling herself Mrs. Thomas, how she had travelled to meet this woman and had handed over her 3-month-old daughter along with £10. She described the receipt she had been given, produced it for the court, identified the handwriting as belonging to correspondence she had received, and she described how she had grown suspicious when her letters requesting updates went unanswered, how she had gone to Reading to investigate, how she had learned that Mrs. Thomas was actually Mrs. Dyer. Under cross-examination, Kapadia attempted to suggest that Marmon could not be certain her child was the body recovered from the Thames, that the decomposition made positive identification impossible, that other infants might have been dressed in similar clothing. But Marmon was certain, recognising specific details, a small birthmark, a particular pattern of stitching on the gown she had made herself. She broke down crying on the stand and the judge called for a recess, the jury visibly moved by her testimony, the spectators in the gallery wiping their eyes or murmuring in sympathy. Next came the police witnesses, beginning with Detective Inspector Anderson, who described the investigation in methodical detail. He presented the evidence found in Amelia's house, the infant clothing, the pawn tickets, the white tape, the wrapped bodies in the privy. He explained how the disposal method matched the bodies found in the Thames, how the tape used matched the ligatures found on the victims. He described Amelia's confession, reading portions of it aloud in the silent courtroom, her words condemning her more effectively than any prosecutor's argument could. Anderson's testimony took most of a day, Kapadia's cross-examination unable to shake his account or cast doubt on the evidence chain. Dr. Morris, the police surgeon who had examined the bodies recovered from the Thames, testified about the cause of death, describing how strangulation with tape had killed the infants, how the marks on their necks matched the tape found in Amelia's possession. He showed photographs to the jury, images that made several members visibly pale, that captured the reality of what had been done to these children. Under questioning from Kapadia, Morris acknowledged that the body's state of decomposition made some aspects of analysis uncertain, but he was unequivocal about the cause of death. These infants had been deliberately strangled, and the method was consistent across all the cases he had examined. Arthur Palmer testified against his mother-in-law, describing how he had helped dispose of parcels in the Thames, how he had been told they contained old clothing, but had come to suspect the truth, how he had been paid for his silence and assistance. His testimony was damaging, confirming that the disposal operation was systematic and that Amelia had orchestrated it. Under cross-examination, Kapadia tried to paint Palmer as an equally guilty party trying to save himself, but Palmer's testimony remained consistent, his details specific enough to be credible. Other mothers came forward, one after another, each telling a similar story of desperation and trust betrayed. A housemaid who'd been seduced by her employer's son, a factory girl who'd been raped walking home from work, a widow with 3 children already who could not afford a 4th. Each had answered Amelia's advertisements, each had paid the premium, each had handed over their infant and walked away believing the child would be cared for. Some had never heard from Amelia again. Some had received brief letters saying the child was well, then silence. None had ever seen their children again, though many had tried to find them, writing to false addresses, searching for locations that did not exist, eventually giving up in despair or forcing themselves not to think about what might have happened. The cumulative weight of this testimony was devastating. The jury heard not just about Doris Marmon, but about dozens of other infants, creating a picture of systematic murder on a scale that Victorian England had never encountered. The newspapers reported every detail, their accounts spreading across the country, generating outrage and demands for the death penalty. The public followed the trial with intense interest, discussing it in homes and workplaces, debating whether Amelia had acted alone or whether others shared responsibility, arguing about what social conditions had created the environment in which such crimes could occur. Kapadia's defence, when it came, was brief and ineffective. He called no witnesses, relying instead on his closing argument to make the case for diminished responsibility. He described Amelia's difficult life, her poverty, the deaths of her husbands, the pressures that had driven her to her desperate trade. He suggested that prolonged stress and hardship had affected her mental capacity, that she had not fully understood the wrongfulness of her actions, that she deserved mercy rather than condemnation. But his arguments rang hollow against the evidence of systematic planning, the years of successful operation, the confession that showed clear understanding of guilt. In his closing argument, Danckwerts methodically destroyed the defence's position. He pointed out that Amelia had operated her business for 30 years, adapting to the changing circumstances, evading investigation, demonstrating intelligence and calculation. He noted that she had used multiple aliases, false addresses, careful disposal methods, all evidence of someone who understood she was committing crimes and took steps to avoid detection. He reminded the jury of the white tape, the parcels, the bodies in the Thames, the mothers who had trusted this woman and whose trust had been rewarded with murder. And he asked them to do their duty, to find Amelia Dyer guilty of murder, to send a message that such crimes would not be tolerated, that even the unwanted and unnamed deserved justice. Justice Hawkins's instructions to the jury were clear and pointed. They were to determine whether Amelia had killed Doris Marman with malice aforethought, whether the act had been deliberate and premeditated. If they found these elements proven beyond reasonable doubt, they must return a verdict of guilty. The question of diminished responsibility required evidence of genuine mental incapacity, not merely difficult circumstances or emotional distress. And the evidence before them, the judge noted, showed a woman who had conducted a systematic business, who had planned and executed her crimes with efficiency, who had understood enough about guilt to write a confession attempting to shield her family. The jury retired to consider their verdict at 4 p.m. They returned in 4.5 minutes, the speed of their deliberation making their conclusion clear before the foreman spoke. The clerk asked for their verdict on the charge of murdering Doris Marman. The foreman stood and pronounced the single word that sealed Amelia's fate: guilty. The courtroom erupted in applause and shouts, spectators rising to their feet, the judge pounding his gavel for order. Amelia stood motionless in the dock, her face showing no emotion, her hands gripping the rail before her. Justice Hawkins pronounced sentence immediately, the black cap placed upon his head to signal that death would be imposed. He spoke of the heinousness of the crime, the betrayal of trust, the murder of helpless infants for profit. He noted that while Amelia was convicted of only one murder, the evidence suggested she had killed hundreds of children, making her crimes among the most extensive in British history. And he sentenced her to death by hanging, to be carried out at Newgate Prison within 3 weeks, as the law required. Amelia heard the sentence without visible reaction, simply nodding slightly as if confirming something she had already known. She was led from the dock by the warders, disappearing through the door that led to the cells below, beginning the short journey toward the scaffold. The trial had lasted less than 2 days, but its impact would resonate far longer. The newspapers reported the verdict with satisfaction, editorial writers, praising the jury and judge, calling for reforms to prevent such crimes in the future. The public felt vindicated. Their horror at the Thames murders answered with justice to them, and the mothers who had testified, who had confronted the woman who had killed their children, felt a mixture of relief and grief, knowing that the killer would be punished but unable to bring back what had been lost. The trial of the century was over, but the reckoning with what Amelia Dyer represented, what her crimes said about Victorian society, about poverty and shame and the disposability of unwanted children, that reckoning had only just begun. Chapter 10. The Long Drop. Newgate Prison stood at the corner of Old Bailey and Newgate Street in the heart of London, a fortress of grey stone that had housed condemned prisoners for centuries. Its walls were thick, its cells small and dark, its corridors echoing with the footsteps of warders and the distant sounds of the city outside. The condemned cell where Amelia Dyer spent her final 3 weeks was located in a section of the prison reserved for those awaiting execution, separated from the general population, monitored constantly by female warders who watched her day and night to prevent suicide or self-harm. The cell contained a narrow bed, a small table and chair, a Bible, and little else. A window high on the wall admitted grey light but offered no view except a small square of London ski. Amelia adapted to the routine of the condemned cell with the same practical acceptance she had brought to every other circumstance in her life. She ate the meals provided, slept when the lights were dimmed, spoke politely to the warders, requested nothing. She spent much of her time reading the Bible, though whether from genuine religious feeling or simply to pass the hours was unclear. She wrote letters to her family, apologising for the shame she had brought them, insisting again that they had known nothing of her crimes, asking them not to visit her, as she could not bear to see them in such circumstances. The letters were read by prison authorities before being sent, part of the constant surveillance that defined life in the condemned cell. The Reverend Meredith, the prison chaplain, visited her daily, attempting to minister to her soul to secure some acknowledgement of sin and expression of remorse that might reconcile her with God before she faced judgment. Amelia spoke with him readily enough, discussing scripture, acknowledging that she had done wrong, expressing regret for the pain she had caused. But there was something hollow in her contrition, a performance of penitence rather than genuine feeling. When Meredith pressed her about the number of children she had killed, asking her to confess fully so that she might be forgiven, Amelia became vague, saying she could not remember exactly, that it had been many, that she had tried not to think about it while it was happening and could not bear to count the total now. The question of how many children Amelia had killed would never be definitively answered. The police estimated at least 400 victims based on the length of time she had operated, the frequency of her advertisements, the number of infants that could be processed given her methods. Some investigators suggested the number might be higher, perhaps 600 or more across 30 years, but without bodies or records or systematic documentation, the true count remained unknowable. The Thames had kept some secrets, had dissolved evidence in its currents, had carried small corpses out to sea where they would never be recovered, and Amelia herself either could not or would not provide an accurate accounting, her memory of the individual children lost in the repetition of her crimes, the victims blurring together into an uncountable mass. Outside the prison, public interest in the case remained intense. The newspapers continued to publish articles about Amelia, interviewing people who had known her, exploring her background, attempting to understand how someone could commit such crimes. The debate about baby farming intensified, with reformers calling for stricter regulation, for licensing requirements and regular inspections, for criminalising the taking of premiums for infant care. Parliament responded with legislation that would be passed later that year. The Infant Life Protection Act of 1897, which required anyone caring for more than one infant to register with local authorities and submit to inspections. It was reform that came too late for Amelia's victims, but might prevent future tragedies. The question of Amelia's sanity was raised again in the days before her execution, with some arguing that she must have been mad to do what she did, that only insanity could explain such systematic killing. But the official position, upheld by the medical officers who examined her, was that she was sane and had been sane throughout her crimes. Her actions showed planning and rationality. Her confession demonstrated understanding of right and wrong. Her behaviour in prison revealed no signs of psychosis or delusion. She was, the doctors concluded, simply evil, a person who had chosen to kill for profit, who had felt no empathy for her victims, who had transformed murder into a business practice without the interference of conscience or remorse. On the morning of June 10th, 1896, Amelia woke in her cell knowing it was her last day. She had been informed the previous evening that the execution would proceed as scheduled, that no reprieve had been granted, that she should prepare herself for death. She ate breakfast, tea and bread, though she had little appetite. She met with Reverend Meredith for a final time, praying with him, receiving what spiritual comfort he could provide. She wrote a last letter to her daughter Polly, brief and restrained, asking forgiveness and urging her to live a good life. Then she waited, sitting on her bed, the warders watching her, the minutes moving toward 8 o'clock, the appointed time. The executioner was James Billington, an experienced hangman who had conducted over 100 executions since taking up the position in 1884. He had arrived at Newgate the previous evening to prepare, examining the scaffold, testing the trapdoor mechanism, calculating the drop required based on Amelia's weight and build. The science of hanging had been refined in recent decades, the goal being to ensure instant death through fracture of the cervical vertebrae rather than slow strangulation. Billington had measured Amelia during a visit to her cell 2 days earlier, had determined that she required a drop of 6 feet given her weight of approximately 150 pounds. Too short a drop would result in strangulation, too long might decapitate. The calculation had to be precise. At 5 minutes to 8, the procession formed outside Amelia's cell. The governor of Newgate led, followed by Reverend Meredith reading from the burial service. Then Amelia herself walking between 2 female warders, and finally several officials and witnesses who would observe the execution and sign the certificate of death. Amelia walked steadily, showing no fear or resistance, her face pale but composed, her lips moving in what might have been prayer. The walk from the condemned cell to the execution chamber was less than 50 feet, a short corridor that led to the room where the scaffold stood. The execution chamber was a small windowless space lit by gas lamps, dominated by the wooden scaffold in its centre. The trapdoor was clearly visible, 2 panels of wood held in place by a bolt mechanism, the gap beneath leading to the pit below where the body would fall. Above the trap hung the rope, already noosed, the knot positioned to one side as required for the quick fracture of the neck. The room smelled of wood and oil and fear, though whether the fear was Amelia's or belonged to the others present was unclear. Billington stepped forward as Amelia reached the trapdoor, positioning her carefully on the marked spot, her feet placed precisely over the centre of the trap. He bound her legs with a leather strap, working quickly and professionally, his movements practised from long experience. Then he produced the white hood, the linen bag that would cover her face, shield the witnesses from her final expression. Amelia submitted without protest, standing still as the hood was placed over her head, her features disappearing, her identity reduced to a hooded figure on the trap. Billington adjusted the noose around her neck, positioning the knot carefully behind her left ear, where it would do its work most efficiently. Reverend Meredith continued reading, his voice steady despite the solemnity of the moment. "Man that is born of woman hath but a short time to live, and is full of misery. He cometh up and is cut down like a flower. He fleeth as it were a shadow, and never continueth in one stay." The ancient words echoed in the small chamber, a liturgy of mortality recited over countless condemned prisoners through centuries of execution. Billington stepped back, his hand moving to the lever that would release the trapdoor bolt. The entire process from entering the chamber to pulling the lever had taken less than 30 seconds, the speed considered merciful, giving the condemned no time to dwell on what was about to happen. He pulled the lever with a firm motion. The bolt shot back. The trapdoor swung open with a crash and Amelia dropped through the opening, the rope snapping taut, her body jerking once and then hanging still. The calculation had been correct. Death was instantaneous, the neck broken at the second vertebra, consciousness extinguished before pain could register. The witnesses stared at the empty space where Amelia had stood, the sudden disappearance always shocking despite its predictability. Below, in the pit, her body swayed slightly, the rope creaking. The doctor present descended to examine her, checking for pulse and respiration, finding none. He pronounced her dead at 3 minutes past 8 o'clock on the morning of June 10th, 1896. Amelia Dyer, who had killed perhaps 400 children across 3 decades, who had transformed baby farming into systematic murder, who had been one of the most prolific serial killers in British history, was dead at the age of 59. The body was left hanging for the required hour, then cut down and carried to a room where it would be stripped and examined, the rope marks photographed for the official record, the cause of death certified. Later that day, Amelia would be buried within the walls of Newgate Prison, in the small courtyard where executed criminals were interred, a grave marked only with her initials and the date. No memorial would mark the spot, no stone would record her name. She would disappear into the ground as her victims had disappeared into the Thames, anonymous and unmourned, her existence reduced to a file in the prison archives. Outside Newgate, a crowd had gathered in the early morning hours, waiting for the notice of execution to be posted on the prison gates as custom required. When the black-bordered notice appeared at 15 minutes past 8, confirming that the sentence had been carried out, a cheer went up from the assembled people, a sound of satisfaction that justice had been done. The newspapers would report the execution in their afternoon editions, providing details of Amelia's final hours, describing her calm demeanour, noting the efficiency of the hanging. The public would read these accounts with grim satisfaction, feeling that a monster had been removed from the world, that at least this one threat to helpless children had been eliminated. But even as Amelia's body cooled in its unmarked grave, the larger questions her crimes had raised remained unanswered. What social conditions had created the market for her services? What failures of law and moral regulation had allowed her to operate for 30 years? How many other baby farmers were still conducting similar businesses, still killing infants for profit, still exploiting the desperation of mothers trapped between shame and poverty? The execution of Amelia Dyer was an ending, but it was not a solution. The system that had enabled her crimes continued to exist. The need that had driven mothers to seek her services remained unaddressed. Victorian England would eventually reform its approach to baby farming, would pass laws requiring registration and inspection, would increase penalties for child neglect and abuse. But these reforms came slowly, implemented gradually over years, and they could not undo what had been done. The children Amelia had killed remained dead, their lives cut short by the white tape and brown paper and dark water, their potential extinguished before it could be realised. Their mothers lived on with the knowledge of what they had done, carrying guilt and grief that no legal justice could assuage. And the Thames continued to flow through London, its waters still dark, still carrying the city's secrets, though perhaps a few fewer than before. The candles in Newgate burned low that evening, their light falling on the stone walls that had witnessed so many deaths, so many final moments. The execution chamber stood empty, its trapdoor closed again, waiting for the next condemned prisoner, the next morning, the next drop. And somewhere in the vast darkness of Victorian London, in rented rooms and back alleys, in workhouses and lying in hospitals, unwanted infants continued to be born, and desperate mothers continued to make impossible choices, and the machinery of poverty and shame ground on, indifferent to individual tragedies, producing the conditions that made monsters like Amelia Dyer possible. History turned the page in the dark. The Victorian age continued its progress toward a new century, carrying with it all its contradictions and hypocrisies, its grand achievements and terrible cruelties. And in an unmarked grave in Newgate Prison, the woman who had killed 400 children lay silent at last. Her crimes finally ended, her name remembered only as a warning, a cautionary tale about the darkness that could hide behind respectable appearances, the evil that could flourish when society created victims and then looked away from their suffering. The long drop was finished. Justice, such as it was, had been done, and the world moved on. The candle burned low, the chamber fell silent, and history once again turned the page in the dark.